the next speaker hails from Turin, Italy. A later speaker is going to be Chris Sparling. Chris, someday Luca Delana and I are going to teach you what real coffee is like. And that's a whole story. But about 4 or 5 years, 3, 4 years ago, I started reading about this concept, ergodicity, and I'd start trying to talk about it to people in my office, and their eyes would glaze over. And I pretend to like mathematics. I do like mathematics. I pretend to be a mathematician. I don't think I am. And I couldn't explain the concepts very well. And then I came across Luca Delana's book and explained all these concepts in non-mathematical terms that I felt were really, really useful. I started sending this book out to many friends of mine. And Luca gave a talk at VALUEx Clusters, where I think that he developed a following. He's got a new book out where I wrote a blurb/introduction. I'm not sure what Luca's done with it, but what I said was it's about playing long-term games. And we know that Berkshire Hathaway and Warren and Charlie have all played long-term games, and it's easy enough to talk about. But Luca goes into the detail of how to do it, and I think that his natural home is the Berkshire community. But this is Luca's first time here, and so welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me, Guy. And good morning, everyone. We are all congregated here because of Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, and, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened with the font, but I'm sorry. And the focus on the long term and what they've been achieving thanks to their focus on the long term. And I guess that everyone here in this room shares the same focus on the long term, but it is so hard to put it in practice and to actually succeed over the long term. And why is that? What is the #1 obstacle to winning long-term games? And it is my belief that the #1 obstacle is the belief that if we optimize every single day, we also optimize the year. And this is a false belief, because if we try to get the most out of every single day, we will only do things that bring maximum result today, but we will not do those things which do not bring result today, but are extremely important and necessary to win over the long term. Things, for example, such as building long-term assets, for example, skills, relationships, trust. And the tricky thing is that over the short term, you can get away without building skills, trust, and relationships. Even worse, over the short term, you actually grow faster if you do not care about building skills and relationships. And instead, all you do is just trying to get the most out of what you have now. But it only works up to a certain point. It only works for a few months, for a few years. And then you discover that you cannot grow more than that. And the reason is because growing more than that required building long-term assets, required building skills, trust, relationships. And then the other thing that you don't do if you try to optimize every single day, the other problem is that you also get too much risk. Because the amount of risk which is optimal over the short term is higher than the amount of risk which is optimal over the long term. I always make the example of lying. Imagine that if you lie, you only have a 1% chance of getting caught. It means that you have a 99% chance of getting away with it. It's a great short-term strategy. However, if you lie once a week, you have a 99.5% chance of getting caught over 5 years. So what is a great short-term tactic becomes a terrible long-term strategy. But again, the problem is that if you start doing everything very honestly, then you look left, you look right, and maybe you see other people getting away, growing faster because they're lying, because they're taking more risk than you, and then you start wondering, is my strategy really the best one? If it's the best one, why am I falling behind? And you get the temptation to imitate the other ones which are getting ahead in the short term. But again, if you do, you will not grow after more than a certain amount of time, and after that maybe you will get risks that will not lead you to the success you wanted over the long term. So what is the alternative? The alternative is to leverage the iterated nature of long-term games. For example, recognizing that when you speak to a customer, to an employee of yours, it will not be the only time that you will do that. If it were the only time, then the rational thing is to get the most out of that interaction, to get the most sales out of that meeting with the customer, maybe to push the sales. But if it's going to be an iterated game, then the best approach is another one, is to play that interaction, not to win it, but to make the next one better. Another thing, again, is not take repeated risks. We've seen that with cheating, with lying. This is something that maybe you can get away if you do it once. It's definitely not something that you can get away if you're playing iterated games. And the thing is, of course, if you want to succeed over the long term, you will have to play iterated games. It's not a choice. Third thing is, again, I apologize for the font, but train your people. I work with so many managers who do not train their people enough. And the reason is because every week there is something better to do. There is something more urgent to do. But the problem is your long-term potential is ultimately capped by the long-term potential of your people. And if you never invest time growing the potential of your people, you're limiting your own potential. However, again, you might understand that, but then you go back to your work, and it never feels like the right time to train your people. There is always something more urgent to do. But winning long-term games means that you start taking long-term actions even when it doesn't seem the right time to do. Because it will never be the right time to do, but if you never do it, you limit your potential. And then the last thing is do not consume trust and attention. I see so many companies and people who have a mailing list, for example, and they send emails to get the most out of that email, the most sales out of it. And that works if you measure a single email, but basically they're training their audience not to read the emails anymore. And instead, the alternative approach, the one, for example, I use with my mailing list, is to send each email to give value and build trust so that I make my audience more likely to open the next email. And then, of course, I am not saying that you should not sell. I'm not saying that you should not take risks. But I'm saying that you should only do it in a way that makes sense over the long term. And I think that that's what's really needed to win long-term games. I always make the example of the casino croupier. He's the only person at the gambling table with a money-making strategy. And yet, every day he sees at least one player getting way richer than him. But he must resist the temptation to switch from his good money-making strategy to the worst money-losing strategy of the players. So, my recommendation is to only imitate reproducible strategies. Because the problem is that out there are so many strategies which are not reproducible. By which I mean, yes, if you do that strategy, you might win. But the chances are that you don't. And this is something that works over the large numbers. If 100 people take these risky strategies, there will be a few that win. Maybe they win even more than you. So you might be tempted to imitate them. But that works only because of the large numbers. And you are only one person. Your company is only one company. And if you try to adopt a non-reproducible strategy, the chances are that it will not work for you. So this was my invitation. Well, we all know the importance of winning long-term games, but I hope that I gave you some good arguments for how to do it and how to explain to the other people that that's the right way to do it.
Awesome. Thank you, Luca. That was fantastic. I'm just curious. I mean, Luca lives not far away from me in one of the best cities on the planet. I can tell you, Turin is amazing. It's got amazing food. It's got amazing wine nearby. And it took me so long to find him. But I'm just curious. This so clearly is the Berkshire Hathaway system, at least to me. And I just like to see in a raise of hands with whom it resonated. If it resonated with you, raise your hands if that made sense to you. And yeah, like the whole room, Luca. You should have been coming to the Berkshire Hathaway meeting the last 30 years. And did anybody say, look, I knew, and it's okay, I mean, I knew all of that. When I came to some people and talked about ergodicity, they're like, that is such a trivial idea. I can't believe you didn't understand it already. And in a way, I didn't. It really took a while for me. So I'm going to ask one question because we're behind on time. Luca, there are a bunch of investors in the room. Which companies, ideally publicly traded, do you think are really good at playing long-term games that you've seen? Present companies, so exclude Berkshire Hathaway, but maybe companies in Europe that you've worked with that you're willing to talk about, where you think they've done a good job of that at scale?
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm not very much of an investor, so I can only judge like not the price and valuation, but from what I see, companies that do play the long-term game, I'm seeing, for example, Amazon. If you look at the way they manage people, they're basically trying to remove all the risks. They're trying to scale, of course, but the thing is that they've only tried to scale in ways that make sense for the long term. They've tried to avoid a lot of shortcuts that make it problematic to scale, to retain scale. For example, accumulating managerial debt, accumulating some types of debt that enables you to scale fast, but then at a certain point it starts dragging you down. So this is an example. Then there are some other companies I work with, they're not publicly traded, but I think that for me the number one thing is whether they're chasing, they need to be chasing growth fast, because if they don't, they won't grow fast. But two, they need to only chase it in a way that makes sense in the long term and never compromising on that.
So I'm going to do another question selfishly. So I live in fear of what it is that I should be doing today that will only pay off in 10 years' time, that if I don't, in 10 years' time, I'll look back and I'll say, wow, that was what I should have been doing. And it's one of those long-term thank you notes, I think, is one of them. So my question to you is, you don't know me very well or the people in the room, what are some of the actions that you think some individuals in this room might be taking today that they're not taking, that they ought to be taking, the kind of things that build, I guess it's all, I don't know if you come with any courses, building your own personal capacities, building goodwill, but I hear it from you anyway.
Thank you. So for me, one thing, if you're not doing it yet, I've learned it from Guy, for example, it's about like the importance of maintaining relationships, the thank you notes. Another thing, if you have a company, train your people. That's so important, and train them well. And if you don't know how to train people well, learn it. Because one reason why people don't train it is because they don't know how to do it, so it looks like a waste of time. And then another thing is manage risk. Manage risk is something we always postpone. Don't postpone, because eventually you will incur in risk if you didn't manage them.
Luca, grazie mille. You know, and one day we will teach everybody here to love espresso. We will. Thank you.